Good morning. Voice in the sky, I always appreciate that. Hello, everyone. As Voice in the Sky mentioned, I'm Scott DeSouza. I'm the president of Friedman Insurance Group Assured Partners. And I want to welcome everyone to the Dubuque Area Chamber 2022 Forecast Luncheon. 2021 was an interesting year. I have a grasp for the obvious, you can tell. It was very interesting to say the least, and we look forward to 2022 with hope for prosperity in our community and around the nation. We are thrilled today to have two phenomenal speakers who will provide a regional and national overview of the economy. I'd like to begin by welcoming our first presenter with the regional overview, and that will be Dr. Peter Erasum. Dr. Erasum has been on the faculty at Iowa State University since 1982 and currently serves as the University Professor of Economics and Director of Program for the Study of Midwest Markets and Entrepreneurship. He is a 1977 graduate in economics from the University of Kansas, received his PhD in economics from Yale University in 1983. He is a past member of the Ames City Council, Ames Convention and Visitors Bureau, and the Ames Economic Development Commission. And in 2018, he served as a Fulbright Fellow at Univerza na Primorskin in Slovenia. Now say that about 3 times. And I did have to practice that, Doctor. Please won't you welcome, and please give a great Dubuque welcome to Dr. Peter Erasum.
Well, thank you for the invitation. I've been at Iowa State for 40 years. I think this is the 3rd time I've been asked to give a talk in Dubuque, and it's never been above 0. And I'm just saying I'm also available for talks in June. So I'm supposed to give the regional perspective. I'm a labor economist by specialization. And one of the things that's true about this pandemic-related recession is it's all about the labor market. And we're not going to fully recover from this recession until we can figure out how to solve some of the problems with our labor market. And I think Elliot's going to reinforce that from a national perspective, and I'll give you a sense of what that looks like from the local perspective. So some of the things that we'll talk about, obviously we're going to start off with talking about labor markets. It has the advantage that labor, if you're looking at regional information, the labor data comes much more frequently. It comes every month. And if you look at a lot of the other measures, they come at a long lag. So I will make some reference to sales tax data later on as a measure of the taxable retail sales here in Dubuque, but we're going to be 6 months behind, and so we're going to have perhaps not as good a picture as to what's going on the taxable retail sales area or the hospitality industry. And I'll talk a little bit about why this is such a strange recession. This is not a typical recession. I'll show that in some of the data that I'll show you. But the unemployment rate for Iowa right now is 3.7%. In Dubuque, it's 2.7%. And you say, well, that's just fabulous. Why aren't we happy? And the answer is Dubuque has 3.1% fewer jobs than it had before. And so typically you have the unemployment rate and the employment rates that sort of tell the same story, and that's no longer the case. And so we'll have to figure out why it is that the labor supply, which is they're just not showing up. So why is it if you have what looks like a really strong labor market, why aren't people responding to that strong labor market? And I'll talk a little bit about inflation. Elliot's going to spend more time on that, but I'm old enough to remember inflation. And so I'll talk a little bit about why some of the things that we see now look a lot like what things looked like when I was a student in the 1970s, and why we might have some bigger problems in terms of the current inflation, and why it may persist over time. And then the last thing I want to talk about is what does it mean returning to normal? Obviously, no longer wearing masks is one of the ways that we're going to return to normal, and we hope that we're going to be in our I mean, my Christmas card, I realized I was writing the same Christmas card this year that I wrote last year. And then I had to make stuff up. So hopefully next year at Christmas I'll have something, more interesting to say. But I'm going to argue that Iowa faces a bigger uphill battle in terms of fixing its labor market problems than other places. And hopefully I'll be able to get to that in the time allotted. So we start off with just saying, okay, what does the Dubuque labor market look like? And I was actually surprised to see how much it mimics the distribution for the state of Iowa as a whole. I would have thought that retail or hospitality industry would be a bigger share of the Dubuque labor market. It turns out that it's a larger share in Cedar Rapids than it is in Dubuque. So all of the hospitality industry is concentrated in this area here, and the rest of Dubuque County doesn't have that much. And so the overall hospitality industry is relatively small and roughly equal to the same share that you would have in the rest of the state of Iowa. There's a little bit more manufacturing in Dubuque. There's a little bit more finance and insurance in Dubuque than the state as a whole. And there's less government in Dubuque than there is in the state as a whole. And that's true of metro areas. One of the reasons why Iowa has a relatively high share of jobs in government is because we have 99 counties. And most of them, that's pretty much all they got was the county government, right? So the share is high elsewhere. If you're a large enough city, you can expand government services faster than you can expand government employment, and so you don't have as large a share there. When you look at manufacturing, there's a different story between durable goods manufacturing and non-durable goods manufacturing. Non-durable goods manufacturing in Iowa, that's going to be largely related to food and food processing, actually gained jobs, about 4% relative to pre-pandemic levels. Durable goods manufacturing, about 8% loss of jobs. But here in Dubuque County with John Deere, they've had a fabulous year. And so the prospects for durable goods manufacturing in Dubuque County are actually pretty good. Now, how people responded to the pandemic depends on the types of jobs they had before the pandemic. And so this is a picture of some of the metro areas in Iowa, the state of Iowa as a whole, and what's happening in the U.S. Everybody took a huge hit in March of 2020. And for the most part, places have started to come back. What's interesting is places like Johnson County or Iowa City have basically continued to shed jobs during the pandemic. Dubuque is roughly matching the state of Iowa, which is because Dubuque's distribution of jobs is by sector is roughly the same as it is for the state of Iowa as a whole. And Des Moines is doing a little bit better. One of the stories you can see is if you were expanding your labor market before the pandemic, your recovery is better. If you are flat, Dubuque's labor market was relatively flat, the recovery is a little bit more complicated. If you were on the downward trajectory, which Iowa City was, going into the pandemic, the recovery is much worse. And so if you look at Cedar Rapids and Iowa City, they're 6 to 7% below where they were pre-pandemic in terms of their employment. If we focus more on one of the homework assignments I had was to talk a little bit about the hospitality industry. The data isn't as precise as that for counties the size of Dubuque or counties the size of Story County. And so the hospitality industry is in the group called private service providing. And you can look at that particular group and you get roughly the same story. So in Des Moines, they're about 2% back loss of jobs in that sector relative to where they were when the pandemic started. In Dubuque, we're at 4% below. The Iowa average is around 3.5%, so roughly coincident. And then once again, if you look at Iowa City and Cedar Rapids, they took a much larger hit on their hospitality industry than Dubuque has. And they're going to have a more serious time recovering from that because they were on a downward trajectory going into the pandemic, and some of the factors that were leading to that downward trajectory are exacerbating the effect of the pandemic on their economies. Now, if we have fewer jobs, you would think that that's going to have an adverse effect on incomes, and the answer is 2021 was actually a pretty good year for per capita incomes. And if you look at the last recession, you'll notice that we were actually below. The usual thing in a recession is per capita incomes drop. Now, when you come out of it, you get a big bump. We actually had per capita incomes rise in this pandemic-related recession. And the question is going to be, why do we look like we're actually not in a recession when you look at this from an income perspective? One of the things that we can look at is what's happening to wages. Usually in a recession, wages fall. And across almost all the places in Iowa, Cedar Rapids being the exception, average wages rose. And they rose not as much in Dubuque as they've risen elsewhere, but 2022 promises to be a pretty good year with a fairly good settlement with the John Deere plant, and that's your largest employer. And so you're going to get a big bump in terms of wage growth coming into the new year. But wages in Dubuque are the third highest of wages, average wages in among the metro areas in the state. And then if you look at wages by sector, once again, manufacturing isn't as strong in terms of wage growth in Iowa, but that's going to be changing. And the strongest place for wage growth is in leisure and hospitality. And that's going to be specifically related to how hard it is to find workers. So the sectors that find it hardest to find workers are experiencing the fastest wage growth. And so then we have to figure out what's going to be the story with the lack of workers. So this is something that I did for a really simple little project. It's to look at what is the relationship by state between changes in their labor force and changes in employment. And the upper right-hand quadrant are going to be the states that have actually increased both their labor force and their employment since the start of pandemic. And that's 4 states. They're Utah, Arizona, Idaho, and Texas. The bottom left-hand quadrant are going to be the states that lost both employment and labor force. And there are some states that have managed to increase their labor force, but not jobs. And no states have managed to increase jobs, but not their labor force. And I further separated the information by whether the state was relatively aggressive in fighting the pandemic and states that were relatively more accommodating of economic activity during the pandemic. All of the states in the upper right-hand quadrant are the ones that were more accommodating of their economies. All of the states, well, there's states that are both in the accommodating and non-accommodating group in the bottom left quadrant. But in general, what you find is there is a trade-off. You could fight the pandemic and take an economic hit, or you could allow more of the spread of the disease in exchange for getting greater economic activity. So on average, the more open states lost about 0.6% of their labor force and about 1.7% of their jobs. And in the less accommodating states, they lost about 1.9% of their labor force and about 4.2% of their jobs. Iowa has done worst of all the states that tried to accommodate their economy in terms of the loss of labor force and the loss of jobs. And the question is, why does Iowa look so much worse? We look worse than Nebraska, we look worse than South Dakota, where the policies weren't that different from what they are in Iowa. And what I'm going to argue is it's going to be related to the nature of the labor force that we have here in Iowa. So if you look at national data on job openings and hires, we look like we're in a boom, right? We have an increase in the job opening rate. We're adding 10 million job openings nationally per month. We're only filling 6 million of them. We now have 4 million unfilled vacancies. It used to be a good month when you had 4 million job openings. And that's entirely driven by the slow labor force response to what looks like a very good opportunity, right? If you look at some of the other information, quit rates are high. Iowa had the 4th highest quit rate in the last couple months. Quit rates rise during economic booms. Quit rates plummet in recessions. And yet we have the highest quit rates in the history of the United States, well, as long as they've collected the data, in the last few months in the job openings and labor turnover survey. So it's such a strange market, and it's related to weak labor force responses to what looks like good opportunities. Wages are rising, and there are lots of jobs available, and if you quit your job, you can immediately find another job. So what's happening to the labor force? This is the national data, and we're at half where we were. This is, Iowa's a little bit worse than this. We had an immediate drop in labor force participation. About half the people re-entered the labor market, and almost nobody has re-entered the labor market since. We've opened schools since then. Childcare has been more available. We have vaccine rates. All of that should have caused a labor force response, and it didn't. And so the question is, what's happening to them? And are we going to go forward? Sorry, hang on. There we are. So this is what's happening to the labor force. And this is broken down by age group. And you'll find that we have less labor force in each of the age groups, but we're about 1% below for people who are what are called prime age workers, 25 to 54. A little bit older, 55 to 64, we're at 1.1% below where we were pre-pandemic. The biggest drop-off are people 65 and over, and a slightly smaller drop-off for people who are 55 to 64. So why does that matter for Iowa? We're old. We're older than South Dakota, we're older than Nebraska, and South Dakota and Nebraska are doing better. We're not as old as Florida, but people who retire to Florida go there not to work. So they were already not working. People who stay in Iowa and are older were working, but now they've retired and they're not coming back. And our age structure is causing a huge problem, and that's why we're responding much more slowly to the opening up of our economy than all of the other states around here. Unless we can get old people like my age, to start working again, which ain't gonna happen, or we can suddenly increase the number of people entering the labor market at younger ages, which is going to be a challenge, or we bring in people from other countries, which has been always the buffer for labor market problems in the US, we're going to have a lot of trouble filling positions in Iowa because every other state wants the same workers, and we're a relatively low-wage state, and we're relatively colder. And those ain't problems that are going away anytime soon. Next issue is going to be hospitality. So we have some information on, this is based on taxable retail sales. It only goes up through June. They're a little bit behind at the state level. And so I can give you numbers through June of 2021. And what I did was I put out what the trend line would have looked like at the second quarter. So at the end of June in each of these years. And if you look at taxable retail sales in Dubuque County, they were rising at about 2.5% per year. And you can see what happens when we have the pandemic. So the dots are the second quarters, right? And so we're going along there, and this was June of 2022. We lose about 11% of taxable retail sales in that quarter relative to what you would have expected based on past growth. You look at June of 2021, and we're actually 7% above the trend line. So some of those lost retail sales came back. It's unlikely that that's going to persist. We're not going to have that accelerated retail sales going forward. It's probably going to revert back to that longer-term trend line. But we did manage to make back some of the lost sales that happened during the pandemic. If you look at the hospitality industry more closely, so this is what the trend line was for growth of restaurant sales. This is what the trend line looked for general merchandise. General merchandise in Dubuque County was dropping at a little bit less than 1% per year, and that was a long-term trend related to the rise of Amazon and breaking the market for bricks and mortar companies. Retail sales in restaurants and bars were rising at about 2% per year in Dubuque County. If you look at what happened in the recession, those sales went away, and of course, they're not coming back, okay? If it's non-durable goods, you've lost those sales. But we're back near what the trend line would have been by June of 2021. And hopefully, if the remaining retail sales data comes in over the next couple months, we're going to find out that you're back on trend, and it's likely that Dubuque is going to be back on trend after that. Okay. Elliot's going to talk more about inflation, but like I said, I'm old enough to remember it. So I'm going to say a little bit about inflation. Inflation begins to surge in the second quarter of 2021 when you started to see a surge in taxable retail sales here in Dubuque County and in the state of Iowa as a whole, and as it turns out, in the nation as a whole. And so you get the surge of demand in one quarter at the same time that the supply of product is constrained. And that's a classic cause of inflation, except that the underlying cause is a little bit more, I'd say, concerning. And that's if we look at the role of transfer payments in inflation. So transfer payments have been rising as a share of total income in the United States for a long time because people my age are retiring, right? So the baby boom is exiting the market. We're getting transfer payments in the form of Social Security and other services, and we're not producing goods and services. And so that share is increasing, but it particularly increased and didn't abate that much in the Great Recession, and it surged again in an unprecedented way in the last couple months of this pandemic. And then the question is that permanent or is it transitory? And the answer is, if you look at compensation, what you get in income as a share of what you produce, that compensation as a share of income is historically at low levels right now. It dropped even more at the beginning of the pandemic. It dropped again at the start of 2021 with some new tax policies and credits, and some people got like $1,200 for living to January 1st. It was like pass go, you get $200, and except it's real money. I mean, it's not just monopoly money. And so transfer payments as a share of total income is a higher share than it's ever been, and it's stayed relatively high. Now, the old cause of inflation was too many dollars chasing too few goods. That's exactly what happened in this particular case. I have to quit. And I'll let Elliot take over. So the last Econ 101 slide. When you look at the old thing, households produce goods and services in firms, and then they buy them back. So you have production and income that are roughly coincident with one another. We no longer have production and income that are roughly coincident with one another, and that's driving inflation, and it's not going to go away very soon. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. Our next presenter is the bow tie economist, Elliot Eisenberg, PhD. an internationally acclaimed economist and public speaker specializing in making economics fun, relevant, and educational. Dr. Eisenberg earned a BA in economics with first-class honors from McGill University in Montreal, as well as a master's and PhD in public administration from Syracuse University. Eisenberg is the chief economist for Graphs and Laughs, LLC, a Miami-based economic consultancy that serves a variety of clients across the United States. He writes a syndicated column and authors a daily 70-word commentary on the economy that is available at www.econ70.com. I highly recommend it for its sheer randomness. It is really, really good. Won't you please welcome Dr. Elliot Eisenberg.
Wow. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. I've only been to Dubuque once now, and it's again minus 277 degrees. And feel free to invite me with Peter again in June or July or whatever it is. It looked really pretty from my hotel room. The parts of the window that weren't frosted over looked beautiful. But I will tell people it's lovely and all that kind of stuff. Where do I begin? Am I going on? Here we go. So look, I have a lot. So Peter and I chatted earlier. We have some things generally in common. There are a few areas where he's a little more optimistic or pessimistic than I am. I'll try and point them out so you can hear that economists don't all think monolithically or something. But I'm a pretty happy guy for 2022. 2021 came in at great GDP growth. It'll turn out to have been something like 5 or 5.5, I don't know exactly, but a really good, well above trend number because we had all this stimulus money that Peter talks about. We got unemployment money, we got stimmy money, there's PPP money, and all this sort of, and child support money that came in, and on, and it's kind of going away a little bit. 2022 is going to be less, it's still going to be pretty good. We're going to get what, 3.5% this year for a lucky stretch, maybe we get 3 3/4 or 4, it depends how bad Omicron is, right? And Omicron will go away. It's going to be a bad month or two, but then it hopefully moves away, and hopefully it's not followed by another one of these variants. We don't know, like the Omega, or the Omega or something. Who knows? We'll see. But let's look at the basics. GDP is composed of 4 terms. This is a college course. Peter probably knows this equation from backwards to forwards. C, household consumption, the first term in GDP. It's 69, call it 70% to make it easy, percent of GDP. It's great, or it's terrible, as the case may be. It's so good, it's terrible. This is the problem Peter talked about. Demand is completely recovered right off the bat. Normally in recession, incomes go down, people don't spend, and we husband our resources, hold on to our money, and don't do anything. And by contrast, now it's, oh my God, I got stimmy money, we got unemployment money, I kept my job, I didn't go to Kruger National Park, that's where Peter wanted to go and look at buffaloes or something, or elephants. Instead, I'll buy a Peloton or 6 Pelotons and a big screen TV and a pergola and make a backyard and a pool or something, right? So C is so good. C, demand is here, supply coming back kind of slowly with the labor problems that Peter talked about, that I'll talk about some more. So demand, supply, and it's so good, it's causing inflation. We'll talk about how other recessions cause unemployment. This recession's caused inflation because we've recovered so fast, demand so strong, and supply hasn't kept up. So the first term, great, it's too good as the case may be, right? It's phenomenal. Second term is I, corporate investments in plant and equipment. Firms aren't investing too much in plant because we don't know what the plant will look like. Where will we work? Will we work downtown? Will we work in our house? Will we work? How often will we work and where will we be doing it? But firms are investing in stuff, and they're going to try and rebuild inventories, which are way down from where they were before. So I should be pretty good too. I is roughly 15% of GDP. If you put them together, that's 85% of GDP. If 85% of GDP is doing well, here, who cares about this part? Government, exports, and imports. Yeah, sure they matter, don't get me wrong, but the other ones are really good. Government's going to be somewhat contractionary compared to 21 because the stimmy checks are gone, and the unemployment benefits are gone, and the child support payments are gone, and so on. It isn't that it's going to go terrible, but it's going to be less, right? Be less stimulus a little less. So let's look at some details. This is real retail sales. And I think this really tells you why our supply chains are completely screwed up. I mean, you look here, where the trend, then a 20% decline. Okay, that's a bad, terrible recession. You look at the prior recession here, this is the housing bust. We didn't fall by 20%. No way, we fell by 10. Here, this is the dot-com. We didn't even go down. Here we collapsed. And then, okay, now we have a COVID
epidemic on our hands, right? And then, because we're home and we have nothing to do, what do? We start spending our brains out. Boom! So we collapse, we have a pandemic, we skyrocket, and then countries like China that have a zero tolerance policy, so you have a city like, I'm making it up, Beijing has one person, they close the whole city down. I mean, I'm almost the truth. 100 people and they close down a town, a city of like 20 million people. And unlike the US where we have only 1 or 2 cities that big, China has like 30 of them, right? Because the population's 4 times ours almost. But this bust and boom, pandemic at the same time, no wonder our supply chains were wrecked. And supply chains can fix themselves if they have 1 problem or 2 problems. But when you have 37 problems, they can't fix themselves. And that's why we continue to be in this problem. Home builders can't get doors, and we can't buy a car, and all newsprint is unavailable. These crazy things you have. Here's another example of what's going on. And this is totally counterintuitive. In normal recessions, historically, think about this. You're about to lose your job. You have a choice. You can go to a baseball game that costs $20, or you can buy a new car that costs $40,000. You have to do one of those 2 things. What are you going to do? You go to the ball game. It's $20. This time it was completely the opposite. I have my job, I got stimmy money, if I'm unemployed, I don't have to pay my mortgage, I don't have to pay my student loans, I don't have to pay my rent. Oh, let's buy stuff. So, wrong way. So we're buying the hell out of stuff. I don't know how much stuff we need. I'm totally stuffed out. The Amazon person drops like $9 a day at my house. I bought a Peloton for me, for my wife, for my girlfriend, for my mistress. I'm done now. I'm not kidding. I mean, look, this is so abnormal. And that's exacerbating supply chain problems. It's more complicated to build and deliver a Peloton, for example, than it is like a mustard packet. Even those sometimes, right, those do. Services are coming back, that's good. This might mitigate inflation down the road as goods come down and services go up, but I'm not sure about that. That's sort of a work in progress in my own sort of empty mind. But this is a crazy recession. Demand's phenomenal, and demand for goods, which are cars, it's nuts. And why is this? It's because of COVID. COVID still runs our economy. We thought in July it was all over, and then came Delta, which wrecked up Q3, and now comes Omicron, which hurt December of Q4, and now will hurt January and February of Q1, pushing GDP for the first quarter certainly well down. But the good news is it looks to be coming down from very high numbers. So I have a couple thoughts on this. First, and Peter and I may disagree with this, I don't like looking at these numbers anymore. They're not terribly informative, but I want to know about what's my chance of dying. And if I can get that data, and CDC should be putting that data out everywhere and always. Don't give us the stupid caseloads, which are meaningless, and then at home, we do our own test. Oh, it's positive. Oh, I better, quarantine. Forget it. I'll put a mask on. It'll be fine. I'll get my friends all sick. No one tells if you're positive, and no one knows. We don't know the test, the ratio. So we want to know death. This is the single one. Just look at the number of deaths in your community, in your state. See what it's done. That will give you a much better measure of how much safety you should engage in. Should be 6 feet, 12 feet, 20 feet, 100 feet, never go outside, figure it out. But we should be showing the mortality numbers because these are no longer indicative because this is a much more contagious variant, but much less deadly. In part because maybe it's naturally less deadly, and partly because so many of us have been exposed, be it through injections and boosters or through actually having gotten COVID at some point, right? So it's changing from being a pandemic to becoming an endemic at this point. Now, on one hand, that's good news. There's general herd immunity. We're getting there, not as fast as I'd like, but we're making progress. We don't know how long this immunity lasts. 6 months, a year, 2 years, how it boosted again, we don't really know. The problem is, this endemic doesn't mean it's not bad. It could be at a relatively high level. So the normal flu, kills 35,000 Americans a year, 100 a day. If this gets down to that level, okay, I'm not so concerned. But what if the perpetual state is something like we're in now? Or something even a quarter or a fifth of what we're in now? That's elevated. It'll keep workers away, and it will exacerbate the problem that Peter talked about earlier. We just don't know what the end phase is of what level of disturbance the end phase is. It's good as becoming endemic, but we don't know what endemic exactly means. But all in all, this is pretty good news. This is consumer confidence put up by the conference board. It's not great, but it's not bad. It was there before COVID. It completely collapses. It gets better. and then Delta and Omicron come. It's now improving a little bit. This is decent. It's not great. And these numbers will get worse. These numbers are a month old, and the Omicron numbers are going to come out, and they're going to whack these numbers. So consumer confidence is going to hit. And now, look at this graph. This one's really quite scary almost. This is the University of Michigan Confidence Index. There's a couple different ones that come out, right? One called Langer, usually Bloomberg puts out consumer comfort too. This one, by contrast, looks like trash. And the question is, the other one looks, this one will make it a little worse too, because Omicron's here. And the question is why? This one actually is January, so it's more recent than the other one. Why? This prior survey asks you essentially, hey, do you get a job? And the answer is, yeah, there's lots of jobs out there, no problem, thank you very much. I may not want one, but they're around. And because they're so around, I don't have to look for one. Because when I want to get a job, there'll be lots of jobs. So the fact that there are so many jobs available discourages me from looking for a job. I'm not kidding, this is true, right? So this is a good slide because it says there are lots of jobs. This one, by contrast, Michigan survey, these are both national surveys, they're not local. It's not a Michigan survey, it's put up by University of Michigan. It asks essentially, hey, how about you want to buy a car? And how about a house? And how about inflation? So 3 touchstones. No one in their right mind today wakes up and says, oh, let me buy a car and a house. Because you can't find either of them. They're not available. Like a used car now. I have a used car. I have a car. I moved down to Florida. I used to drive a crappy car. It was a Mercury crap box. I think that was the name of it. It was a 4-door sedan. Your grandfather would be embarrassed to drive the car. But when you live in DC, your car gets dinged all the time. And no one sees your car because you come to work by subway. It doesn't really matter. Now I'm in Florida, you are what you drive. I drive a black convertible, it's very cool. But I still have this crappy car. This crappy car is 2007 Mercury, probably worth $150,000 now. Because it's a used car. It's worth more money. So no one wants to buy a used car or a house now, but that's what this is getting in on, right? This is lack of supply. Peter talked about it. We can't make anything. Demand is strong, supply can't get to, the workers aren't showing up, and then you can't get labor and inputs and parts and transportation services. So even if you make something, you can't get it to market. You can't get it from market. We'll talk about it. And this is COVID. This is sort of real-time data as of Jan 17th, so it's really recent open table data, right? And you can see the problem here. So just before the Omicron variant comes, I'm struggling with this wrong way. Pardon me, user error here is just pervasive. So this is 0. This is where we were before COVID. Think of 2019. That's where we were. We had just gotten ourselves back to normal nationally. Warmer states like Florida up on top, right? Texas, the states that didn't close down so much as Peter suggested. The states that are getting better. And then there are some states that are doing worse. Illinois, Pennsylvania, New York have closed down more. Overall, and then all of a sudden Omicron comes. Bam! The number of people going out to eat's way down. It isn't so much that the government's telling them you can't do it, although in some cases they probably are. But it's more people just go, whoa, I'm nervous. I'm not going to risk my life for a hamburger. I mean, that's just stupid. Your discount rate had better be damn high to take a risk like that. Yeah, I might die, but I'll have 30 minutes of pleasure before I croak. I don't think so. Not for me, anyways, and probably not for Peter either. So we're going to have a tough Q1. There's no doubt about it. But hopefully, by a month from now, end of February, this Omicron's largely gone. It's burnt through the population, and we're on to bigger and better things, hopefully, right? This is total personal consumption expenditures. This is all of C, the first term in GDP, 69% of GDP. It's terrific, it's fine. I mean, that's part of the problem. If you look at the past recession here, right here, this is the housing bust. Look how long it took. It didn't go down that much, and it took years for it to come back. Like 3 years to come back. Here it takes like 30 minutes. I mean, there's no reason, there's no magic here. Massive fiscally stimulative policies or massive monetary stimulative policies. You get both, and suddenly we get inflation all of a sudden because we're producing more than we want. We're not producing enough, we're demanding more than we can produce. If you think back to, Peter's old enough to remember this, the Vietnam War, you were still a middle-aged man at that point or something. You know, the Great Society was taking place. Lyndon Johnson was trying to solve poverty on one hand, and we were in Vietnam. That's too much capacity for our economy to produce. We couldn't produce the butter domestically and the guns internationally. And we began to develop this inflation that lasted 20 years, and it finally broke its back in 1980. See, right now, we have the same problem. We have this insatiable demand that's recovered instantaneously, and supply that just isn't there. We have to have demand come down to solve this problem, because supply will not go up fast enough to get there. And that's why the Fed's going to raise rates, and that introduces the whole fear of what happened with it. And we'll get there, but not quite yet. Now, let's change focus and look at manufacturing. Are they happy? They're out of their minds happy. This is ridiculous. I don't understand why, quite frankly. They were happier 6 or 8 months ago. I get it. This is 15 years of data. Rarely has it been happier than the manufacturers happier than they are now. I swear these guys get up every morning and do a line of coke or something. I don't understand how they can be so happy when you can't get labor, you can't get parts, you can't get raw materials, you can't get a truck, you can't get a plane, you can't get a train, you can't get a conductor, you can't get a truck driver, you can't get an engineer for a train. You can't get anything, but they're happy. Now this numbers will come down because of Delta Omicron, but not much. Because demand for goods has been very strong because we're stuck at home. So I have a 30-inch television I bought last year. I want a 40-inch television. I want a 50-inch television. I have more time. I'm watching more TV. I'm not going anywhere. This is services. They've already started to come down, and they'll probably come down more. But they'll also come back pretty quick. We've learned to live with COVID. I mean, look at this room. This room is testament to the fact that we figured out how to live with COVID as individuals, as households, as businesses, and as governments. You know, some of us take more risk, some take less risk. But think 2 years ago, in the middle of a pandemic upswing like you have now here, would you be out here? The answer is not a chance. No, we were all scared to death that we were going to die in a minute. And now let's party on. I mean, we're cautious. You know, we're not all. I tell my mother to stop licking doorknobs. That's her hobby. You know, she holds off now. But you know, we're learning how to live with this. This is the point. And these waves that come are not nearly as detrimental because we have experience and we've been boosted and vaccinated and exposed, or all three, right? As the case may be. This is small business. So many of you are in the small business category. And you know, I wouldn't say you're ecstatically happy, but you're not miserable either, right? That's misery. That's COVID hitting. That's terrible. This is Trump winning the election. There. This data from the National Federation of Independent Business is no longer quite as useful as it was. Over the last 10, 12 years, it's become noticeably politically oriented, I guess is the best way to put it. And the economy didn't obviously miraculously just skyrocket and improve when Trump became president, right? I mean, sentiment may have improved. So this is, but still, it shows, hey, look, this is okay. Manufacturers are happy enough, service providers are happy enough, small businesses are happy enough, households are spending money. This is pretty good. This is the problem. There's nothing on the shelf. Whatever you want, you can't get it. Look at the bottom right-hand corner. Retail inventories, they're non-existent, right? So companies now are going to spend the whole year of 22 trying to rebuild inventory. I thought that by now, I thought like 8 months ago, that by now they had begun to rebuild the inventory. But the supply chain problems are much more serious than I thought, which we'll talk about in a second. And the labor problems that Peter spoke about are very serious. They're much more serious than we all thought originally. Think back to 6, 8 months ago. Remember when the federal government offered large amounts of unemployment benefits? A number of red states cut unemployment benefits a month or 2 early before the program ended in Labor Day, right? And some of the red states ended in July. And the blue states let it run all the way through the end of August or early September. And the question was that extra money that the government gave you to stay home and not work, was that going to alter the environment? Were we going to get a groundswell of people running to work because suddenly this money wasn't there? The answer turned out to be essentially no. The reason the labor market's not working is much deeper than that. But this problem has to get solved. If this problem doesn't go away, inflation persists. Because we want stuff, we can't get it, right? Used cars are more expensive, new cars are more expensive, homes are more expensive. Everything's more expensive, you can't get it. So what's the Fed going to do? Raising rates going to do what? It's not going to solve supply chain problems. On the contrary, it's not going to work. But it'll certainly dampen demand. And as we dampen demand, inflation will reduce. Because we won't want so much stuff because interest rates will be high. I want a car, mortgage payment's too high. I want a house, cost of the mortgage payment's too much. And suddenly things begin to calm down. Our economy slows and inflation starts to move state right. How fast it happens and how well it happens, and mistakes occur, well, yeah, but nonetheless. And this is part of the reason the supply chains are wrecked. The ships can't get unloaded. If the ships don't want to be unloaded, they can't get there. So at first, you look at the blue, and the blue drops like a rock. You go, wow, big improvement. No, the ships just they head fake us out. The ships now are steaming across the Pacific Ocean more slowly because they know they're not going to get unpacked when they get there. What's the rush to hurry up and wait? We can just go slow, suntan ourselves, sit back, relax, enjoy the Pacific Ocean. So they either hang out further away or they slow shift themselves. The red and the blue together is the key. The bad news is it's high. The good news is it's not getting higher. A bunch of data came out today, and they come in almost every day on supply chains. Prices paid, how much are prices going up, how much more are you charging for your stuff, things like that. And all of these numbers seem to be peaking out. Almost none are getting worse at this point. So my belief here is that we're seeing now the worst of the supply chain problem. The problem is, does it go on for a month, 6, or 12? And we're going to get to that in a couple of seconds. So here, they asked this question, people who know the answer. Sort of, no one knows the answer because no one knows the future, but that having been said. They asked it on November and then January 14th. November 4th, the consensus was here with a little bit of there, right? Then they asked it 2 months later, like last week, January 14th. That's the same, but now it's going up, and now people are starting to think it may take till 23. This is a long time. If the supply chain problems persist and labor market problems persist and inflation stays this high for this long, we begin to have a problem. It begins to get into our heads. If it gets into our heads, then we want pay raises. Well, inflation's been going on for a year and a half now. I want a 7% pay raise. And then Peter has to charge more for consulting because the money he pays his research assistants goes up. And then they will have more money, and he charges for demand, pull, cost, push inflation in the textbooks, and you're off to the races. And the Fed goes, no. We gotta ratchet things down, please. That's the aim here, what the Fed's gonna do. So what do firms do in the midst of all these problems? They can't get workers, they can't get supplies, they can't get raw materials, they can't get transportation. Oh, we'll buy intellectual property. So look at this. Out of control, not out of control, just huge, tremendous amount of desire for robots. Think of it. You're a company, and you're a restaurant, and you're a burger chain, right? And you can't get workers. You buy a robotic arm, and the robotic arm goes into the hamburger mixes up, takes out, puts a hamburger on the fryer, And this may cost you $100,000, but the machine doesn't get sick, doesn't need unemployment insurance, doesn't need welfare, doesn't need any help, right? You learn how to do it. Firms are investing in equipment. This makes this recession and situation different. Look at this graph. This graph goes back to 1995. We got 25 years of data. Never have you seen this, till 2 recessions ago. So this is the dot-com bust. Spending goes down, comes back to where it was. It's the housing bust. Comes down, goes back to where it was. That's it. There was no improvement. And then there's inflation to boot here, right? And now, by contrast, there's a very small decline. Here, big decline, small decline, and then a rocket skyrockets up. This is because supply chains are a wreck. If you can't get workers, in the past couple of recessions, there were ample amounts of workers. Unemployment stayed high for a long time. I'll show you some graphs on that soon. So firms didn't have to invest in equipment because they knew they could hire workers. And if the recession didn't really last very long, if it came back, you could just fire your workers. It wasn't a big deal. But now, since workers are in such short supply, investing in equipment becomes a much more reasonable idea, and firms are taking advantage. At least you can get it, right? This should increase labor productivity because there was more capital per worker. The workers got more machines to operate. They can make more pizzas or socks or semiconductors or John Deere tractors or whatever, right? Corporate profits are great, right? Q4 profits that are coming in right now, earnings season's coming out now, they're going to be great. We're not concerned about Q4 profits, we're concerned about Q1 and 22, and that's what's driving the market right now. So what have firms done with the corporate profits that they've earned? They bought back their shares. I'm going to give you some insight here. Insight from a stupid economist. What 2 years in the recent past were the lowest years for share buybacks? 2009, we were in the midst of a recession. That was the housing bust, global calamity. In 2020, what were firms not doing in those 2 years? buy back their shares. What should you be doing in recessions when they hit? Buying shares. I'm not going to give you financial advice here, but this gives you some insight to what you might want to do. Now, firms can't do it because they're afraid in 2020 that they weren't going to exist in 2021. We're entering an abyss that was of unknown duration, an unknown magnitude, and we better hold on to our money and pray hard. And they kept their money. And then, when the stock market starts to improve and things are like, now we'll buy back our shares at overpriced prices. I digress. But you get my point. But, so the stock market's doing well, earnings are good, shares go up because earnings are good, and now firms take back shares, reducing supply of equity, pushing up share prices more. So the stock market has done terrifically well. Okay, the last couple of weeks, not so great. It'll eventually turn around. The stock market, this has been everything rally. House prices are good. Commercial, industrial property has been good, self-storage has been good, logistics has been good, cold storage, warm storage, cell phone towers, they've all been great. The only real exceptions here have been office towers and retail, right? They're the ones that have really suffered. Lodging hasn't done so great either. But short of that, things are pretty good. And then household savings are crazy. Peter talked about that too. We got the stimmy checks, we had nowhere to go, nothing to do. You can see it right here. This is stimmy check 1. Oh, oops, I'm doing it wrong. Hold on. There we go. Stimmy check 1, stimmy check 2, that's I think $1,500 or something, $600, $1,400. Now it's back to normal. But we've built up this huge amount of savings, $2.5 trillion of savings. I think the savings goes away at some point. Among the lower classes, they'll spend it away, and it'll be gone by the end of this year, early next or something. And among the upper income classes, this becomes wealth. They're not going to go out and spend it all, it becomes wealth. This should dissipate a little bit of demand for stuff. Not enough to solve our problem, but it'll help dissipate a little bit. And look at household balance sheets. They're in great shape, because the government balance sheet's not in such great shape. There's been huge transfers, as Peter mentioned, from the government to households in all kinds of ways, right? So the government's running deficits, they ran deficits in 20 and 21 of roughly $3 trillion apiece, up from roughly $1 trillion apiece before, and our deficits will go back down there in the short run. Then they'll start to go up as we age, right? But this is terrific, and if you look at this, look. This is the month of February, late Feb to late March, Feb 20 and March 20, when the housing was bust. When COVID went crazy originally. The stock market was falling 3,000 points a day, right? And then stimmy checks come and things have changed all of a sudden. And then, wow, look at this. We go from 110 trillion bucks to about 145, 150 trillion bucks. In no time flat. Households have never been better. Household bankruptcies are way down, credit card payments are on time, mortgages aren't being defaulted on. It's remarkable. You can see it right here. This is bankruptcy numbers for 2020. We don't have 2021 yet, but through the months that I've seen it, it remains low. They're the lowest they've been in history. Not history, but in recent past. This is 20 years of data. And the only reason 6 was so low was because Congress changed the rules in 2005 for bankruptcy. So when people knew it was going to be hard to declare bankruptcy in 2006, they raced to declare bankruptcy in 2005. I don't know how you pay your lawyer for going bankrupt, but that's a whole other conversation. But households are in great shape. Savings levels, total savings amounts are high. We have money to spend. So even inflation is not really stopping us from doing stuff. This is remarkable. So households are happy. Firms are generally pretty happy. If they just get more workers, they'd be happy. In terms of fiscal policy, it's going to be contractionary. Because all the stimmy checks and all this free money and largesse from Washington, D.C. is kind of lightening up here a little bit, right? It's being a little bit less. And we've had this before. If you look here, this is the housing bust. In the housing bust, Obama passes the ARRA, $1 trillion, which Peter and I both mentioned, used to be a lot of money. And that stimulated the economy for a couple of years. And then Congress said, no, we better be contractionary because our deficits are getting too large. Of course, the idiots in Washington, D.C. didn't do the hard lifting. The Washington, D.C. idiots said, oh, let's cut discretionary spending a little bit. And the problem is the non-discretionary spending. Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, OASDI, and all those programs are what's going to bankrupt us. So now what happened this time? Massive stimulus again because the economy's collapsing, followed by contractionary policy. What's most interesting to note here, however, is here. This is years of expansionary policy that's not on average all that stimulus. followed by even longer period of contractionary policy that's not that contractionary. I mean, it's 1% of GDP on average, right? Here, by contrast, it's incredibly brief, but incredibly high. Similarly, here it's incredibly brief, but much deeper. It's like we're living life in dog years here in COVID. I mean, think about it. Last July, I took off my mask. I remember it was the end of June. I went into an elevator. I wasn't wearing a mask. I could have been walking on air. I was so happy. And a week later, I put my mask on. Since then, we've had Delta and Omicron, right? So, we're being battered around like a ping pong ball or a pinball machine or something. Now, people say to me, Elliot, we're going to have inflation from Biden's policies. Biden just passed the infrastructure bill. It was a bipartisan bill. There'll be lots of money for roads and all that sort of stuff. Broadband and airports and sewers and police stations and whatever, which is all needed. Isn't that going to cause inflation? It's $1.2 trillion, right? Isn't that a lot of money? And the answer is, yeah, a lot of money, but the first stimulus bill that President Trump signed was $2 trillion. The second one, like $600 billion. And then the Biden one a year ago now, in March, was another $2 trillion. That was almost $5 trillion. And that was just distributed. It was totally deficit financed, right? There was no tax increase on. It was instantaneous. All the money went into our accounts almost immediately. The PPP loans, which were forgiven and so on. This is $1.2 trillion. So it's like a quarter of what we saw last year, 2 years ago, the sum of all that money in our chest. A. B, the government's taking money from elsewhere they would have spent, unspent money here and unspent money there and so on, to pay for it. So it isn't a stimulative thing. And we were on a trajectory to spend $600 billion over the next 10 years on infrastructure anyway. That was the baseline from the last bill. So it's an extra $600 billion over 10 years. That sounds like a lot of money, $600 billion in 10 years. But Peter and I can do the math here. What's the sum of GDP of our economy over the next 10 years? I don't know, $250 trillion, ballpark, something like that. So tell me that $600 billion over $250 trillion is going to massively alter the outcome of the economy. Will this help? I think it will. Will it add a 20th of a point to GDP? Yeah. If we're lucky, maybe even a 10th of GDP. I don't think that much. So this will be mildly inflationary in the short run because there are no workers and supplies and supply chains are wrecked and so on. This is the Build Back Better side, which is now somewhat on life support. But the Democrats need some wins here. So the Democrats have figured out that the way to get a win is to make Joe Manchin from West Virginia happy and Kristen Sinema from Arizona happy. And if those two senators are happy, they'll pass the bill. So now, after ignoring them for the better part of 6 months, they said, let's listen to them. And now they're going to listen. They're going to pass 3 or 4 bills, and they can get some victories before the midterm elections, which they need. So I think they'll pass some of this. During the Q&A, we can talk about that. There's some things in there that are good. There's some things in there that are bad, but that's always the way it is. But it won't be huge. It'll be largely paid for as well, because Joe Manchin says he wants taxes to cover the cost of the packages, reducing the stimulative impact of it. So I don't think either of these bills are all that inflationary. If you put this together, what do you get? These are some forecasts put up by places, right? And they're all reasonable. 5.7 for this past year, 4 for the current year we're in right now, 2.4 for next year. Yeah, plausible. If you want to knock them all down by 0.2 of a point, feel free. There's 2 ways to look at this. One way is, we're going down. Yikes. That's the wrong way to look at it. Between the housing cost of 2009 and just before COVID, February of 2020, GDP averaged about 2% a year growth. Maybe it's 2.1, but you get the idea. And that's all our economy can do. Like because of labor productivity growth on one hand, and no population growth on the other. So lousy labor productivity growth, lousy population growth gets you lousy GDP growth. And we are returning to that lousy GDP growth. And it may be enhanced a little bit because firms have invested in plant and equipment, I talked about earlier, and Biden's infrastructure bill. Those together may bump it up a 10th of a point. Now, a 10th of a point compounds over 20 years, becomes a lot of money. But in the short run, you're not going to notice this all that much. But the point is, we're going to go down not because we're getting rotten, We're just returning to normal growth. Don't look at this as failure. Think of this as, hey, 21 and 22 were really great, unusually awesome years. Yay! And we're going back to, you can't have chocolate cake for breakfast every morning as a 7-year-old. You want to, but you can't. We've just been enjoying too much chocolate cake. Now, let's talk about labor markets. They are the key issue that's probably on all of your minds. You cannot find workers. No matter which industry you're in, you can't find them. Let's review the labor force, labor employment, before we go anywhere. There's this notion that the labor market's not working, the workers aren't coming back, it's all awful. It's true, but it's not. Here's how. On the far left is the dot-com bust of 2020. Here, we lost 3 million jobs, peak to trough. All right? 3 million jobs, the gap between here and there. It took us 4 years to get those jobs back. You lose 3 million measly jobs. It takes you 4 years to get them back. This is the housing bust. Here we lose 8 million jobs, peak to trough. 8 million jobs. It takes us 6 years to get the jobs back. That's a lot longer. That's a lot more jobs. Now we lose 22.5 million jobs. Again, 22.5, more than all of Canada, almost as many as all of Great Britain. I mean, this is 11 years of job growth. I can maybe talk to Peter. When I looked at this data and I think about it now, I start to cry. I mean, this is data you can't imagine. In a week, losing 5 million jobs. I mean, this is what we lost in an entire recession in the past. We lose them in a week. And you see the bottom falling out of the economy, the stock market collapsing, and jobs going away, and businesses collapsing, and marriages being failed, and kids being beaten. And, I mean, the sociology here is really bad. Recessions aren't good for the human mind and families. So, now the next thing. Let's go back to the same graph. It took us 3 years to recover here. It took us 6 years to recover here. 4 years, whatever. Here, 3 years. This is really quick. It's not quick enough because demand is totally recovered. Supply is taking its friggin' time. It's coming back pretty quick by historical standards, but not fast enough. And as Peter said, the workers just don't want to return. They're happy not working. We're going to get into that in a couple of seconds too. But so this is fast by historical standards, but demand is recovered much, much quicker. I mean, so you get this, I'm going to come back to unemployment in a couple of seconds. Here, unemployment. Look at this. So here, this is the dot-com bust, right? Dot-com boom. This is the dot-com boom. Till there, these gray bars are recession bars. And unemployment, boom, goes up. Look how long it took unemployment to even peak out. It took another year or two to peak out. And then it took a leisurely pace, like 5, 6, 7 years, from 2003 to about 2008 or 9, to finally hit bottom, higher than it was before the recession. Long time, right? Now, look at this one. Unemployment is unfathomably high here at the dot-com, the housing bust. And it took a friggin' decade for it to hit down bottom. Almost a decade to get back to where it was. 8 years. 8 years! So now, unemployment now hits 15%. You hit there, it hits 6 or 5.5 or 6. Here it hits 10. Here it hits 15. And that's only because BLS made mistakes in collecting the data, and they said so. Had they not made those mistakes, it would have been 20. So unemployment is 20%. The Fed figures, oh my God, we've got a decade before unemployment comes down. We're in no rush. There's no problem. We can be monetarily stimulative forever. Because look at history. It takes forever for unemployment to come down. And then it fell like a stone. Like an anvil off a cliff in a cartoon, a Bugs Bunny cartoon. This is unfathomable. The decline has been so stone-like. You've got a problem. Because unemployment is now back where it was before the recession begins. And inflation, which we're going to get to in a couple of seconds, is friggin' out of control. The Fed has two jobs, right? Good job growth and low unemployment. Well, low inflation. Good jobs and low inflation. Inflation's going crazy, and job growth is at full capacity now. The Fed's got to start raising rates. They have no choice. They have no cover. They can't say, well, inflation's high, but unemployment's still really high, so we'll let it rip. Or inflation's low, do we want more inflation? No. Everywhere they turn, they've got to do something. So they're going to raise rates. But first, this is a graph Peter put up already about the labor force participation rate. And it's not the only problem, but it's a major problem. This is like 3 million workers that are missing right now. Where are they? I don't know how many of you had a psychology course. Raise your hands in college. You ever hear of Abraham Maslow's ladder? It's 5 rungs, right? The bottom rung, you're crawling on your ground, you're not wearing clothes, you're fighting a grasshopper, you're ripping off the head, and you're eating it for protein. That's ladder rung 11. You're just surviving. Rung 5 is you're self-actualizing. You're like a professor of economics. Or you're the CEO of the Chamber of Commerce. You're less living the dream every day. You're self-actualizing. That's what people are doing now. They are literally climbing Abraham Maslow's ladder. They're going up a rung or two. They're saying, my future, it doesn't mean cleaning bedpans anymore. I'm done with that. It doesn't mean cleaning your dirty linen in a hotel. I'm done with that. This is good for America in the long run. People are happier. That's what life's all about. It's not just making stuff. It's being happy, finding happiness and satisfaction. But in the meantime, it's killing our labor force. So let's go into some details. Peter went into some of the demographics. I'm not going to touch that. This is retirements. Why are retirements up? Retirements are up because the stock market did so well. 2 years ago, Peter and I didn't know Peter yet, but I bet he was thinking, they're going to can my department here at the university. My portfolio's going to hell. My house will never sell. I'm going to go have to back to Yugoslavia to make a living. And go back to the university no one can pronounce. I thought I could never give a speech again the rest of my life. My career was over. I'd be working till 100, again, looking for grasshoppers or something. And then suddenly things reversed. But people have so much wealth. Stock market, bond market, savings, stimmy checks, forced savings, and so on, right? PPP money. They're retiring. And then people who are poor are retiring because they're thinking to themselves, you know what? Think of the worst job during a pandemic of this sort. What's the worst job? I think it's being like a manicurist. Because you walk into the manicurist's place, you give them your hand, and you go, can you please put a flower on my pinky? Each breath is the potential breath of death. I'm out. I'm out of here. I'm not going to die putting painting on people's fingers to make a living. No, I'm retiring. And once you retire at 63 or 64, are you really going to go back? You're done. So people have left because they could afford to leave, or they were too afraid to stay in their job. And they don't come back. So it's retirement, number one. What else is going on? People stay at home to take care of kids. They can't get daycare. Or now, get this, I read about this. My kid's now 23. Still a pain in the neck, but I love her dearly. And what happens? The schools now have like a mental health day, and they close the school down. No, for parents, mental health means having the school open. Right? What do you mean the school's been closed for the last friggin' 2 years? You can't keep it open 5 days a week anymore? What the hell's wrong with you? Please, I'm begging you, open the school. Daycares don't work because banks won't lend to a daycare to expand. And daycares aren't well capitalized, so daycares aren't there, so the schools aren't open, daycares aren't open, and generally women can't go to work. Men, they go. Women don't go. So this is hurting women. Then there's, I hate to say it, but there's death. We're on the verge of having 1 million Americans dead of COVID. Soon, somewhere in the summer, we'll have 1 million. We're in 2,000 a day now. It's up to about 1,000. This is a serious number. You may not know this, but those workers aren't coming back. So you lose, 400,000 workers. Many of the workers are over 65, less destructive labor force. You get the point. And then this is just people not working because they're sick. So they have COVID. It's 500,000 people. I looked on the BLS website 2 days ago. It went from roughly 1 million to 1.5 million. And that's for 500,000. And if you think people aren't going to work because they're afraid of getting COVID, you're wrong. They are. Millions of workers aren't going to go to COVID. It doesn't even have to be big numbers. If it's just 1 million workers, it's 160 of the labor force. But it's 1 million workers. So all these myriad factors together are discouraging. Oh, then there's immigration. Had we kept the policies that Obama had in place, we'd have 2 million more immigrants, all else equal. I mean, COVID could have changed it conceivably too, I understand that, but you get my point. Millions more people working from that reason. And then last but not least, people have taken up the self-employment. And they've said, look, don't pay my mortgage because of forbearance. Don't pay my rent because of eviction moratoria. And don't pay my student loans because of the student loan holiday. And I got a stimmy check, and I got unemployment insurance. This is the best time to go out on my own in the history of the world. And what are they doing? They're going out on their own. So the workers don't go and work for a company that they've got. They're going to go and do their own thing. So now, who's getting paid? Peter talked about this already. College in orange, green is some college, high school, and blue is not even high school. So who's getting the most money? Look, unemployment's now collapsed like a stone among the least educated because all the hotels are opening up. Baseball, basketball, hockey, football, whatever it is, right? Rock concerts. And now they need to have the workers. And the workers don't want to come back. The workers are going, not me, never pay me more money. I really don't want to come back. I have other things to do, like climbing Abraham Maslow's 5-rung ladder. Do it again, it's a short ladder, but you get my point. To get the unemployment rate down for these workers, they gotta pay them a lot more money, because they don't want to go. So here's overall wage growth. It's high. You know, it's somewhere around 5%, 4.5%. It's 4.5%. The best it's been since at least there, maybe even back in 2000, how dot-com boom bust, right? Inflation's higher than that. So real wages aren't going up, even though wages are going up. Real wages aren't going up so much. I'm getting a message to stop. Okay, guys, do me a favor. Put your hands up if you want me to continue. Change in median wages. Now, let's break this down and show you a graph Peter showed you. This is quits. Quits are a crazy high level. They're crazy high. This graph says, depending on which axes you look at, the left or right x-axis. 3% of the labor force quits their job every month. That's 36% a year. Equivalent to 4.5 million people a month changing their jobs. Now, oops, we're going to do nothing. Go ahead. So, look, in a recession, 1%. In this past one, 1.4 in the worst of the house of COVID. That's terrible. 1.4, 1.5. Here's the dot-com bust, 1.5. Okay, 1.5, terrible. Then what's good? Good is considered 2.3, 2.2, 2.3 again. Now we're at 3. Everyone's freaking quitting their brains out. We're spending our brains out and we're quitting our brains out. And we're quitting our brains because we can get a better job getting more money. It's that easy. And then Peter says, you know what? There's no opening for an economist, and they'll pay you $20,000 more. And I tell my brother, and he tells his sister, and she tells the aunt, and it goes on and on and on. Now, as it happens, wages for economists aren't going up so much because we didn't lose our jobs in the first place. But if you lost your job in the first place, whoa, you can make money. So, back to the slides. Look here. Losers who stay in their job. People who quit their job. Look at the difference. People who quit their job make a good 1.5%, 1.25% more money because they get a pay raise when they change their job. Quitting your job makes sense, only if your job is in short supply. I asked my proctologist. No, I don't have a proctologist. If I did, I would ask. And they'd say, no, there's no real groundswell of demand for proctologists out there. Same as it was before, you know. Nothing really new. Accountants, lawyers, doctors, nothing really changing there. But among low-level workers, there's a mass increase in demand. So look at this. You see it here. Somewhere around 2015, the demand for low-skilled workers starts to take off. And their wage growth in blue begins to exceed middle in yellow and high-income workers in green. And then COVID just pushes it into overdrive. If you have a high school diploma, you've never been in more demand in the history of the world. This is completely counterintuitive. It's completely the reverse of normal. You have no skills, yeah, we want you. Moreover, having no skills is no detriment. You know, I think now someone with a high school diploma, yeah, they can get your job, Molly. Yeah, sure, I don't have any skills. I want to run a chamber. Sure, why not? What the hell? You know, I want to become a doctor, sure, no skills, it's okay, surgery's fine. Be a pilot, just walk into the airplane. People can get chances to get jobs they could never get before because they might not have the skills for that job, but they show up, they work hard, they have a good attitude, and they're nice. And that will get them an opportunity. They'll get an interview, and they'll get $500 for the interview, and then they'll stiff the employer and not show up. I can give you story after story of this. It's unbelievable. So inflation, yeah, it's here, although it's not. You know, is inflation here? Of course inflation's here. Look on the far right. Inflation like we haven't seen in a bazillion years since Peter bought his first house in 27, 29, 18%, I think 14% inflation, right? On the far right, you can see it. Blue is headline inflation, red is core, excluding food and energy. This is, you know, since 1990, 30 years of data. This is much less than a couple of years of data. You can see things are starting to peak out. I mean, you just don't have inflationary growth like this. This is, again, this is 30 years of data. It just doesn't happen very much. Here, a little bit, oil prices went kind of crazy back here before the recession hit $120 a barrel or something. This is unusual. And I don't think it gets much worse than it is. This is probably as high as it gets. Q1's probably the peak for inflation. The question that Peter and I are going to argue about philosophically, as we're concerned, is how fast does it go down? And how low does it get? Does it go back to 2? I think we agree they'll never get back to 2 again. That's just not realistic. Can it get to 3 or 3.5? Maybe. I think the Fed wants to get as low as it can realistically, and 3 or 3.25 is probably as low as they get. But it's certainly here. There's no doubt. Now, I'm a little bit more optimistic about inflation declining than Peter is, right? And this discussion that he and I had earlier this afternoon, this morning, is a common discussion going on across the profession. I think a year ago, many people thought it would end, and Peter was in a smaller camp. Now, Peter's camp has gotten bigger, and my camp has gotten smaller. So far, Peter's right, and I'm wrong, all right? But here's why I think I might be right. It still end up being wrong. This is the components of CPI inflation. How do we get 7%? We get it because, you know, services cost more, like haircuts, going to a movie, you know, rock concert, whatever. Then there's this. That's goods. Goods go on ships, and they're susceptible to supply chain problems. If the supply chain problems go away relatively sooner than later, this kind of goes away. And this is energy in purple. Oil prices have gone up from $40 to $80 a barrel, but they're not going to go from 80 to 120, and then 160, and then 200. They level off. So inflation will go away, energy inflation goes away. So I suspect that over the next year or two, half of this inflation, 3/4 of inflation kind of goes away. That's still not fast enough for the Fed. The Fed needs inflation to go down faster. Because if it gets stuck in our heads like it did in the 70s, then we're off to the races and we have this demand pull and cost pull spiral of inflation out of control. And the other reason I think inflation might not be all that bad is real disposable income. So paying your tax, you pay taxes, how much money do you have left on a real basis? You can see it's been trending down. Even though wages are going up at 4, 5, 6%, inflation's 7. Now if inflation starts to go down, real wages go up, then you can have more inflation conceivably too. So it's a double-edged sword here, but maybe I'm right. Hopefully, I hope Peter's wrong. Peter hopes he's wrong too, but that's besides the point, right? Now, this is what the Fed, this is Wall Street. Wall Street knows nothing. Never listen to Wall Street. They may be well-intentioned, but they don't know anything. They're not stupid, they just don't know anything. Because no one knows the future. It's not possible. AI isn't going to help in the future. Machine learning isn't going to help you learn the future. Nothing can help you know the future. It's not possible. If you go on CNN before the markets open 9 a.m., they ask some idiot like John, "Hey John, tell us, what's the market going to do today?" And idiot John says, "Well, it's kind of hard to tell. You know, the bulls and the bears are fighting it out. And the technical analysis is really tough, and who really knows?" Then at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, after the stock market went up 18,000 points that day, they asked, "Hey John, tell us, how come the market had its greatest day in the history?" And John says, "Oh, it's easy. It's because A, B, C, D." At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, we're all geniuses. At 9 a.m., no one knows a thing. That having been said, what does Wall Street think? Take the period 2006 to about 2014, a period of 8 years. This is Fed funds, down and flat. These little lines are the difference between treasuries and insurance-protected treasuries, or TIPS. That gives you some inkling of what inflation is going to look like. So Wall Street thinks up, 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 it's going down. Up, 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 it's flat. Up, 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 up. Finally it goes up. Yeah, a broken watch is right a couple times a day too. They know nothing. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. They're purely knee-jerk response functions. They know nothing of the future. A month ago, Wall Street thought 3 hikes. Now Wall Street thinks 7. Really? Really? That's not thinking. That's just responding to something. So, now that I've told you no one knows the future, I'm going to tell you the future. This is the future. I suspect Fed funds is now an April point. It goes to 7/8 by the end of the year. A rise of 3 times. Fed raises rates 3 times. They raise in March, they raise in June, they raise in September or December. They wait in September, tell us they're going to reduce the size of their balance sheet. Instead, don't raise rates and raise in December. I think they want to not raise 4 times. They got to raise next year again 3 times. You know, they want to wait, slow roll it, and hope that I'm right and Peter's wrong about inflation. If Peter's right, then they got to raise rates more. The more they raise rates, the higher the chances they raise rates too much. And we wind up in a recession. Recessions generally happen when the Fed raises rates because they're too zealous, they tighten too much, and they drive us into recession. So Peter and I hope for our sake that I'm right, the Fed doesn't raise rates too much, we don't wind up in a recession. If Peter's right and the pressure on the Fed's strong, they raise rates too much, they drive us into recession in 23, somewhere at the end, something like that, possible. Hopefully not, but possible, right? And you can see here, if you're a banker, the yield curve is flat, and I'm not going to get into that, but that's not a good thing for lending. Now, I gave you 2 reasons why inflation could get bad. One I talked about, the wage price spiral because of expectations. The second is rents. Rents are a big part of CPI and personal consumption expenditure, the Fed's favorite measure. If these keep going up, the Fed may have to raise rates just because this is going up all by itself and the pressure's strong. The Fed will have a hard time explaining to us, well, the reason it's so bad is rents, and we don't really care about rents. That doesn't look reasonable, right? It's a hard story to sell. Now, I'll talk about housing, then we'll wrap it up. You all own a house? You all own a business for real? The answer is yes. The housing growth price we've seen is real. The problem with housing is we didn't build houses for 10 years. We're underbuilt by 2, 3, 4, 5 million homes. Pick a number. As a result of that, inventory has declined for 15 years in a row. Now, back in 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, no one cared because we were all so badly burdened buying a house, no one wanted to buy a house. Then things got better, housing appreciation was okay, and then COVID comes. And suddenly someone like me who lives on the 13th floor in an apartment building, pushes floor number 13, scratches their eye, gets COVID, and dies. And I go, this isn't so exciting. I better buy a house. Suddenly you can work from home. Suddenly there's COVID. Suddenly you save $30,000 and you can afford to buy a house without paying what you couldn't do before. And that jump-started the housing market. The taste, the demand, the desire to own a house has fundamentally risen across the country. We value houses differently now than we did 2 years ago. There's a change in taste. We want to be in a house. We want more space. And look, it's all a supply issue. This is purely inventory driven. This is inventory in months, 2 months, 4 months, 6 months. This is reversed, as you can see. It goes 0 to 14 normally. I put it backwards, so the arrow goes up, the lines go up, right? You can see when you're 2 months of inventory, price will go up 18% a year. Now we're here, 12% a year. These are uncharacteristically high increases in home price appreciation because there's no friggin' homes to buy because the damn builders took a vacation for 10 years. They couldn't get workers and a whole bunch of reasons here. I'm making fun of builders here, right? Price appreciation, I think, may have peaked out already, although maybe not. Data came out today that was really high. Not that high, but still really, really high. So home sales are outstanding. This is pre-COVID. Since COVID hit, home sales at its worst have been higher than they were at their best pre-COVID. Because the demand is insatiable. Because we all want to get out of our apartments and live in spacious areas. Move to Dubuque. I don't have to live in Manhattan. I can buy 12 houses here in Dubuque, right? And in terms of new homes, there are no new homes either. 0 new homes. Regulatory costs are astoundingly high for builders. Land is expensive. They can't get workers. There's a labor shortage like there is for everybody else, right? And then some workers who would build a home, they're going to do reno instead because interest rates are low and home price appreciation is great. So they're going to do that. Lumber costs have gone bonkers, so builders can't afford to build a median-priced house. is now over $400,000 for the median priced house in the country. So housing starts are kind of anemic. We need housing starts to be here. If they were up there, 2 million units, extra 300,000, 400,000 a year, that would do a dent. That would dent the supply shortage that we've got. But until that happens, house prices aren't going to happen. Credit's going to get easier, more people buy a house. And then demographics. In the short run, demographics are spectacular. Biggest cohort of Americans right there, and they're about to buy their first house. So for the next 5 or 10 years, the demand for housing will be unrelenting, and they're not going to have enough homes. Now, to prove it to you, vacancy rates are super low, so you can't rent an apartment, you can't buy an existing house, you can't buy a new house, you can't buy an apartment. What do you buy? You buy a trailer. Someone said it. Who said it? Mobile home. You said it? Yeah. So that's the price of a mobile home. It went from $52,000 to $80,000. Are you kidding me? I can't afford to buy that. But you're rich, because John, who knows nothing, could afford a ton of life. It went from 108 to 140. You can't buy a single wide, you can't buy a double wide, you can't rent an apartment, you can't buy a new house, you can't buy an existing house. 22 is going to be a good year. Housing prices are going to finally going to slow down. GDP will be 3.5% to 4%. Inflation hopefully comes down. The Fed raises rates in 2 months, literally almost to the day. We should create 3 to 4 million jobs. All the jobs that we lost in inflation, I hope, is not a problem. Maybe Peter's right, and then we're kind of screwed. And as we get out of our house and COVID goes away, spending on services will rise, and spending on stuff will go down. Now, I spoke too long. This is my name, cell number, phone number, Twitter handle, email address. I put out 70 words on economics 5 days a week. The easiest way to get is to take your phone, text the word bow tie, 1 word. You'll be prompted for an email address. Give it to me. You'll hear from me every day until you die. In this email. You've been a great crowd. I've taken far too long. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Elliot. Great words. We have gifts for each of you up here on behalf of the chamber. So I'll give you those before we leave. Again, one last round of applause. We do invite you, if you have questions as we adjourn here. Certainly, I'm sure Peter and Elliot will take your questions. But again, thank you for attending the Chamber's 2022 Forecast Luncheon. Stay warm. Have a great rest of the week. Thanks, everybody.